Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another round of the Dartmouth Dialogue. As you know, this dialogue is the fruit of cooperation between Middle Eastern Studies Program, Jewish Studies Program, and the Dickey Center for International Understanding. Professor Susanna Haschel, Chair of Jewish Studies, is here. Professor Tariq Al-Ari's Chair of Middle Eastern Studies is here. And obviously, Tori Holt, the Director of Dickey Center, is here. And I want to just thank you all three for your leadership. It's this kind of cooperation that made the dialogue on Middle Eastern issues in those difficult times, made it possible on campus, and we're all very grateful for you and for your leadership. Today, we have with us Congressman Jason Crow. He represents the Colorado's 6th Congressional District. He's a former Army Ranger and Bronze Star recipient. Jason Crow grew up working class. He worked minimum wage jobs during high school and enlisted in the National Guard and worked construction to help pay his way through college. After graduating, Jason joined the active duty Army and served in the Army's storied 82nd Airborne Division and in the elite 75th Ranger Regiment. He was deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan, and even when he rose to the rank of captain, Jason always remembered what it was like to march in the boots of an Army private, although he's today in sneakers. Back home, Jason struggled to get the veterans' benefits and knew others were having similar challenges transitioning from service to civilian life, so he went to work helping veterans across Colorado. As an attorney, Jason was named Denver's Pro Bono Lawyer of the Year for work helping service members transition from military to civilian life. Now, Jason has taken his servant leadership to Congress, where he represents Colorado's 6th Congressional District and serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and House Foreign Relations Committee, on which he is the ranking Democrat of the Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee. So welcome, Jason Crow, to Dartmouth, and thank you very much for coming. In conversation with Congressman Crow, we have Victoria Holt, our director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. And she joined Dartmouth in September 2021, but we know her as the director of the Dickey Center, but she also has a career in public policy leadership and diplomacy. In Washington, D.C., she served as vice president at the Henry Stimson Center, a research and policy institute focused on international affairs. And before that, she was Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security and served at the State Department from 2009 to 2017, working, among other things, on UN Security Council and overseeing the offices of peace operations, sanctions, counterterrorism, and UN political affairs. She also led the development of U.S. diplomatic initiatives, including the 2015 Leaders Summit on UN Peacekeeping, hosted by President Obama at the time. She has, in her track record also, she has a lot of writing and speaking widely on UN and regional peace operations, protection of civilians, and atrocity prevention, targeted sanctions, rule of law, and U.S. policy. So there is actually a lot for the two of you to talk about. Also, probably less known is that Tori worked on Capitol Hill for members of the House of Representatives, so there is even more. And before I pass the floor to you, I would like to first to thank a Dartmouth student, Emma Resnick, who's here. She initiated the contact between Congressman Crow and myself, and I thought, we exchanged a couple of emails, we sealed it, and I was like, this is easy, that's great, it's gonna be... I come from Egypt. I worked for the Egyptian government. I always thought it was bureaucratic. I'm just gonna say this. We tried to count the number of emails we exchanged to arrange this visit, and we couldn't. Somebody counted 100 and something, but then we stopped because it's just like, wasting more time on it. But I'm saying this to indicate that this visit wouldn't really have been possible without the work of 3 colleagues present with us. Jennifer Thomas, our administrator at Middle Eastern and Jewish Studies. Thank you, Jen. I don't think anybody else could have got a response to the question, what is the percentage of the money we're spending on the ticket from the total Dartmouth budget? So kudos to you. Also, I would like to thank Judith Jackson from the Dickey Center and the engine behind all this, who's usually hiding somewhere, Tom Camden. So thank you very much.
Yay.
With this,
Well, thank you very much, as a dean. Very much appreciate working with you and your colleagues in Middle East Studies and Jewish Studies to start this dialogue. And before I turn to the Congressman, I just want to note that the Dialogue Project is actually quite intentional. This event is also co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, as well as Jewish Studies, Middle East Studies, and the Dickey Center. And so this is really an intention to have a series of conversations where people of various points of view are able to speak calmly and directly to each other and to elicit a range of opinions. And I hope tonight we will continue that great tradition, because I think it served our community well and actually reflects the spirit of the audiences that we host. So thank you for that. So Congressman, if you might, this topic tonight is American choices in the Middle East and how it affects U.S. global leadership. So this could take a while. But what I might suggest is I'd love to first start with a bit about thinking about the Middle East and what your perspective is on the current state of affairs. Then we'll talk a bit about how that does affect U.S. global leadership and what the priorities might be. But I think all of this is greatly informed by your own path, including, as noted earlier, how you grew up, your service in the military, your choice to become a lawyer, and then to run for Congress. So maybe if you don't mind, I might just start there. Tell us a little bit briefly, like what made you both join the military, and then how do you connect that to your role today as a representative from Colorado?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank Dartmouth for having me here and for the Dickey Center. I've been doing engagements throughout the day, actually. I've had the chance to meet with a variety of groups and faculty organizations, and frankly, I've been blown away by the level of rigor and understanding by the students and the faculty. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is this commitment to freedom of speech and intellectual discourse, and what you have all created here and how special this is, where you bring people together and have really, really difficult conversations on tough issues, and you do so in a respectful way, which I understand has become a model for other institutions, and certainly one for us to all take note of. So thank you for that. And as a dean, for those who didn't notice, who are chiming in at home, is also wearing sneakers. Yes. So there's the sneaker club that's growing here with the organization. And I don't know what you expected when you're dealing with the United States Congress. So there's a lot of layers of bureaucracy and issues. So I think it's par for the course, but really good to be here. And of course, Emma Resnick as well for initiating this and the invitation. I really appreciate it. So yes, all of us are products of our environment in some way, right? We all carry with us our experiences, our baggage, the things that have shaped us, and I'm no exception to that, right? I've had a couple of frames in my life, multiple careers, growing up in a working class family, working in construction, and then enlisting and starting my public service career as a private, which is the lowest possible rank you can start in the military, and then ending as a captain, then becoming a lawyer, and of course a member of Congress. So there are many ways in which that experience has impacted me in the way that I approach my work and the way that I view the world. One of which is when I'm having debates on issues of war and peace and national security in Washington, when I'm sitting up there on the dais in the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we're talking about deployments of troops or authorizations of force, it's just less abstract to me because I know that when we make decisions in Washington, when somebody has to decide to send someone into harm's way or do something, there's somebody who actually has to do it, right? And that person is usually an 18, 19, 20-year-old person from a variety of places around the world, maybe with 8 months, 9 months, 10 months of training. and that person is somebody's son or daughter or mother or father or brother and sister. And I think very deeply about the people that I served with in the situations that we were put in Iraq and Afghanistan. Really untenable situations in many cases, situations that people should never have been put in. And we now know that in hindsight, if we're being honest about those involvements and our history there. So it's real. Certainly something that I think about daily when I think about Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, having served there, and has a really profound impact on how I approach the work and certainly my policy decisions.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think I'll come back to what you found untenable, but maybe we'll first shift a bit to the broad topic of the Middle East. Yeah. And I think when this was planned, we assumed it would be in the news, but just to note, I think just this week, the U.S. National Security Advisor and his team met with the Israeli National Security Advisor to talk about potential further military operations in Gaza. Many of us also woke up and saw that humanitarian aid workers with World Kitchen had been killed by an airstrike. And we also know that there's ongoing concern about this conflict continuing to expand throughout the region, most recently with strikes in Syria on the Iranian, I think it's either embassy or consulate. We know there are attacks in Lebanon that killed UN peacekeepers over the weekend. So it's quite a challenge to break that down and think about how should we be thinking about this. But I'm going to actually ask you that question. How should we be thinking about this region and the conflict? And what's your view of the way forward and how we find peace?
Well, let's start with the general idea that when we talk about the Middle East, we're not doing ourselves a service if we view it as a monolith, right? The Middle East is a very large, extremely diverse place, right? And the politics of Afghanistan and the policy of Afghanistan is extremely different from Iraq, which is extremely different from Iran, which is very different from Israel and Gaza, right? So we can't paint it with a broad stroke. There are some principles, guiding principles, which we can talk about as well, that I think apply across the board. But it's a very fragmented environment right now, and I think we have to look at it in a fact-specific, situation-specific manner. So with respect to Israel and Gaza, right, multiple things can be true at once. And this is hard. I've been in this job. I'm now halfway through my third term, so I've been doing this a little over 5 years, and this is certainly the hardest national security and foreign policy challenge that I have faced, right? Because it's pit many people against each other who previously have been aligned on a variety of issues. We're extremely fragmented, and it requires us to hold multiple truths at the same time. And some of those multiple truths for me is that I'm committed to Israel's security and protecting Israel and the state of Israel. I am committed to the Palestinian people and their right for security and self-determination and for a Palestinian state. I believe that both of those things can't happen if Hamas as a terrorist organization is allowed to exist and operate. I'm committed to the return of the hostages, because we can't have peace, and we have to retrieve and rescue or negotiate the release, which is probably the most likely outcome of the hostages. And on top of all of that, you can have the right to defend yourself and respond, as Israel does, but the manner in which that is done is critical. And that's one of our biggest lessons from our own 20-year war against terror. It's not enough to say we have the right to defend ourselves and respond, because what we had learned is that if you do it the wrong way, you're actually undermining your own security, and you're jeopardizing your own interests. And from my perspective and my experience, that's what's happening right now. That what's happening in Gaza and the level of civilian casualties is not only unnecessary, because there is a different way of doing this, but it's untenable morally, but it's also undermining the national security interests of Israel and of the United States at this point. And we have to have a very different approach to it.
Well, maybe tell us a bit more about that, either drawing on your own experience or what, if you were in the room with the advisors today, would be either tactically or operationally, what would you advise going forward? Some of the goals sound very mutual. People want an end to Hamas. They want a peace agreement that will last and provide security, but it seems very challenging to get there.
Yeah, it's extremely challenging, and I think we actually do ourselves a disservice by not taking a long view and not considering where we need to be at the end of this. The whole adage of beginning with the end in mind. We obviously have disagreement with the current government of Israel as to where that end is, right? It's very clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't agree with a Palestinian state. He's been very clear about that and has spent much of his career preventing that from happening. So we have a misalignment there. But the path forward, looking at our own experience, and there are some similarities, but there's some differences too. And I'll point those differences out because the analogy isn't perfect here. But the similarities are our doctrine from the beginning of our war on terror and the way that we approach military issues is very different from the end of the 20 years. Right? We started this with a military that was based on symmetry, that was based and structured and trained to meet another foreign military on the field of battle. And we evolved that over 20 years into a military that was largely focused on counterinsurgency and asymmetrical threats. And our doctrine and our policies changed along with it, right? And we've developed those doctrines, and we focus a lot more on long-term, intelligence-driven, precise counter-terrorist strikes that actually center the protection of civilians. Because what we learned is that if civilians are killed in the conduct of military operations, that you cannot achieve success. Right? And again, I'm putting aside the morality of this, right? Because morally, killing civilians is wrong and should be justification enough. But even if that is not enough for you, let's just look at the strategy and your desire to achieve success. And you just can't achieve that success if you are killing civilians on the battlefield. Because it seems very simple, but sometimes we have to flesh this out, that if you're killing a civilian, that also is somebody's brother, sister, mother, father, daughter, son, right? And that will further contribute to the fear, the hopelessness, the anger, and the other contributors to terrorism and insurgency that you are trying to combat, and it'll create a much larger problem at the end of the day. So for me, it's centering human-driven security, human-focused needs and human rights and the protection of civilians in furtherance of national security.
And do you think that the United States, as a sort of point of view, now knows that lesson and is trying to communicate that to the Palestinian Authority, to what extent it can, or to Israel, to the countries of the region? Do you feel like that would be the basis for a future ceasefire and peace agreement, or do you think that is still a work in progress?
Well, we're certainly not perfect, right? We don't have a historically perfect track record, and we still make mistakes because these things are hard.
Yeah.
But look at our policies now, right? There's a presidential policy memorandum that requires that when we conduct counterterrorism operations outside of declared zones of conflict, that we have a near certainty, that is our standard, a near certainty that that the objective that we are intending to strike is the objective, and that B, no civilians will be killed in the conduct of that strike. That is our standard.
An American
right?
standard.
That's American standard.
Yeah.
And that's a reflection of our lessons learned and what I just described, that if we actually want to achieve security and do that effectively, that we will center the protection of others. We have a conventional arms transfer policy that requires that we not transfer resources and arms if we have, if there's a reasonable likelihood that it will be used to target civilian infrastructure. So we have this body of guidelines and policies and work that we have developed over the last few decades that are a reflection of what I just described,
right.
Our own lived experience. So the challenge, of course, is applying that in any given instance and looking at the facts and collecting the facts effectively and then applying that and actually ending up with good policy.
Well, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I think you've raised this within the U.S. government. And if I recall, I think you either wrote a letter or you've been part of legislation saying if the United States shares intelligence with an allied nation, or maybe it's at a lower threshold, we need to understand what implications that had for how they use the intelligence and the conduct potentially up to the use of force. Am I partly summarizing that? Maybe you could correct me.
Yeah.
But I think your idea was to say, if this is our policy, how do we understand if it's being implemented?
Yeah, because that is right. And my concern here is this, right? There's direct action that the United States can take. We decide when and where to take military action, what the targets are. We have control over that. But in the current operating environment, we're oftentimes conducting operations by, as we say, by, with, or through allies, right? So either enabling allies and partners to take action, doing it jointly with them or through them. And we can do that by providing them equipment. We can do that by providing them intelligence. And what I believe is that in that environment, the standards should be the same. Right, that we shouldn't have one standard that we hold ourselves to, but in an instance that we decide to provide intelligence or to conduct an operation by, with, or through an ally, and then a different standard applies, or we don't apply a standard. Right, if we're providing intelligence to a partner or an ally, then my belief is we should provide that intelligence consistent with the standards that we've developed that are in furtherance of our values and our policies and our interests. So I want application of that across the board because ultimately we will be judged and we will be held accountable by what we do, either directly or with or through others.
So I want to get to that question about how you think current U.S. policy, particularly with Israel and Hamas and what's going on in Gaza, but broadly in the Middle East, may affect perceptions of U.S. foreign policy more broadly. And you could maybe contrast it a bit with Ukraine, where on one hand, in Ukraine, we have more of a unity of effort with our European allies and partners. We've singled out Russia, and I think in general, our allies and partners are on board. Yeah. And yet they're critical of the U.S. position as vis-a-vis the strong relationship with Israel, trying to get humanitarian access, but on the whole, being supportive of the war against Hamas with the tactics that have upset some others. So how do you square those? Or maybe you don't, and you say, yes, this is the conundrum the U.S. is facing.
Yeah, so I think we have to be careful of that comparison, right? I in no way would ever compare what Russia is doing in Ukraine to what Israel is doing in Gaza. I wouldn't, and let me explain that. Vladimir Putin is very purposely trying to take Ukraine and target civilians and civilian infrastructure. That is his strategy. They are specifically doing that. I don't believe, and I haven't seen evidence that Israel is purposely targeting civilian infrastructure and civilians. Right. Now let's put a pin in that for a minute, right? Because there's a difference between purposely targeting but also hitting. Right? So, and I believe in our support for Ukraine in its aggression against Russia, defense of aggression by Russia. And I think there's a lot of national security implications that go into our support of Ukraine, that if we don't effectively do that, and if we don't come through for Ukraine, will have profound impacts for the world and for our own standing and for our national security. But the perception of the world is that there's a disconnect in our standards, right? The perception is that we are talking about the destruction of civilian infrastructure and the killing of civilians in Ukraine, but you're seeing the same images, and the results in Gaza are unacceptable, right? You still see the results of the civilian infrastructure destruction and the civilians that are killed in Gaza, and the world sees that inconsistency. So for us on the world stage, we have a credibility challenge, and this isn't my opinion. This is just fact, right? This is just what I'm being told. I travel around the world. I talk to diplomats. I talk to foreign leaders all the time. And this is what they're saying. This is not the opinion of Jason Crow. This is the fact, that they're seeing inconsistency, and it's causing a credibility challenge for us. So that's why I'm pushing for a change, because it's impacting the broader project of the United States. Right? We are a superpower. We have to look at all of our interests and make sure that we're pursuing all of our interests in lots of different places. We're looking at a worldwide strategy, and it's impacting our ability to pursue good policy. So on the issue of intent,
Yeah.
right? When I was a soldier, the law of armed conflict, among other things, says that if you are fighting and there is a combatant targeting you,
Yeah.
that you can respond to that combatant, right? And that makes it a valid military objective, even if there are civilians or civilian infrastructure present. But then comes in the issue of proportionality. You have to respond in a proportional way.
Yeah.
So there's a difference in my mind between what you are allowed to do and what you should do. And making a decision to not hit a target, even if you're allowed to under international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, because it'll undermine your longer-term objectives and because there will be civilian casualties or damage done and will undermine your longer-term project and goals, is a big part of what we're dealing with right here. Taking that longer-term view, which is very, very hard to do when you're in combat, to make that decision. But the proportionality decisions are critical.
Well, thank you for explaining that a bit more. I think I will ask another question. I've got 5 to 10, but instead I'll open up to the audience after this one. I'm going to take you way over more on U.S. leadership in the world. And it feels like the two candidates for President of the United States are presenting quite different worldviews. If the Biden administration's continued, they have embraced allies, partners, institutional arrangements. It's about a rules-based order, is sort of the language. Whether it's consistent or not, that's the point they make. And they believe not necessarily in military force, but that being one of the many ways, diplomacy and others, but full engagement, broadly spoken. If former President Trump is reelected, he would have a different point of view. He has laid out a questioning of whether, for example, the NATO alliance really is in the U.S. interest. Do we get enough out of it? He probably is less keen to defend Taiwan if China goes in, from what's been said by both parties, and has questioned other things and really thinks that the U.S. should focus here at home. So do you think this will actually come out in as a foreign policy debate? Do you see those choices as ones that you're grappling with on Capitol Hill? Or is that more just the speeches and the nuance level between both parties is much more complicated than that kind of wider frame?
No, it's a real problem, and it's a real debate, and there's an incredible distinction between the two. There's no doubt in my mind, right? And what's happening, and this is a reflection not just of the former president and the current president's views and the massive differences between the two, but a broader debate going on within our society, between isolationism and populism, and a view that we can't wall ourselves away from the world, right? So there is a rise of populism and isolation as an American that is a result of a lot of things, right? Vast technological change, the loss of the middle class, the gutting of our industrial base, economic disparities. Many things are driving that. There's a lot of understandable and justified angst about our system and the lack of accessibility to the American dream, because the American dream is out of touch for a lot of Americans. The answer to that, in my view, is not trying to wall ourselves off in the world and kind of fortress America, as some people say, and hide from it, because we can't anymore. Right, the answer to that is obviously trying to impact better policy domestically, but also understanding that there's an interconnectedness to the world that is undeniable. Right, we have a global economy. Our communication systems are all tied to one another. We have migration and movement of populations. We have what is an existential threat in the climate crisis that will impact all of us. And we also have weapon systems and technology that don't respect borders, right? Weapons in space. We have weaponized space, weapons in the cyber realm that will give no regard for walls or border entry checkpoints or anything like that. So certainly ignoring that reality would be to our detriment and to the detriment of the American people.
All right. Lots to think about with that. Let me look around the room here and see if we've got people who might have questions. If so, we've got microphones on either side of the room, which you're able to take advantage of. I see a hand here. If you'd like to come up to the microphone, that'd be great. Adam?
Hi, Representative. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you coming to this campus. So I have a question regarding Israel and it being a bipartisan issue. So historically speaking, Israel has garnered a lot of support amongst both Democrats and Republicans. And to say that a lot of progressive Democrats have started being a lot more critical of Israel, it would be an understatement. So I'm just wondering, in the future, do you see Democrats remaining unified in regards to their Israeli policy, or do you think this is actually going to cause a fissure within the Democratic Party? Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't shy away from, I don't buy into the idea that we should be unified on any one issue, right? Because I'm a proud Democrat, and one of the things about the party and the caucus that I belong to is that we're a big tent, and we welcome a diverse and variety of different views, right? I don't want to belong to a party that's lockstep and believes that there's no room for different views within that party or any organization, right? That's not even a political party, but healthy organizations don't reject open discourse and debate, right? Because on complicated issues, nobody has the monopoly on being right all the time. So for one, I don't view it's a weakness on Israel policy or anything else for that matter for us to be able to have that debate and to represent the full and rich culture and views that is America. So that's one. And then two, there is a robust debate about the right path forward here because it's complicated, and I think it's a really important debate to have. Like we're having the discussion right now about how do you hold multiple truths at the same time and reconcile those to move it in a positive direction and to achieve peace. And we didn't even touch on the other issues that are complicating that, like Iranian aggression and Hezbollah and all the other players who are trying to derail that while we're trying to reconcile those competing issues. So it's complicated, but I don't shy away from diverse views and debate on the issue.
And maybe just to add to that, I think within the Democratic Party, there's a well-known criticism of forever wars, which is how both Iraq and Afghanistan have been cast. So how do you find their view, when you say you think the U.S. should stay involved in the world, how do you tackle that set of questions for some of your constituents?
Yeah. Well, they're not forever wars, they're over, right? We're out of Afghanistan, and that was a very difficult withdrawal. It was my criticisms of that are well documented, but again, this is another situation where you can hold multiple truths at the same time, and I can believe that the president made the right decision by withdrawing, which I believe, but also critique the manner in which it was done, and in which that it was done differently. The forever war thing is something that I've taken on because it's personal to me. I actually, was a part of fighting these wars, and what happened was Congress, through authorizations of use of military force, essentially handed to multiple presidents. And this actually is not a partisan issue, right? Because our 20-year war transcended 4 presidencies, both Republican and Democrat, and 10 Congresses, both Republican and Democrat, right? And we gave to the president in 2001 a blank check that allowed conflict and the use of our military for 20 years. And then we debt financed the war, right? We largely through debt paid for it. And then because we don't have a draft and because military service is being done by a smaller and smaller segment of America, the burden of fighting these wars was borne by a very small number of folks who went on deployments over and over again. And largely we stopped having a broad debate in America because we didn't have to, because Congress wasn't involved on this issue. So that's kind of why it happened. And I'm of the view that it's time for that fundamentally to change. That the Constitution says that Congress, the elected representatives of the people, are the ones that make the decision about when America goes to war and under what terms. It's time for us to pull back those AUMFs, repeal them, and replace them with other things that have guardrails in place and sunset provisions that will force us to have a debate and force members of Congress to be held accountable by their constituents for making these decisions and funding involvement.
How will you get there if the White House and the executive branch doesn't want to ask for an authorization to use the force, and many in Congress haven't been willing to claim their right to make that decision?
Well, that's where building coalitions becomes really important, right? No president is going to voluntarily give up this power, right? Because there's no incentive to, right? If you're the president and you're dealing with terrorist threats and multiple threats around the world, you're not going to say, well, I'm not going to pull back and not deal with that, because the risks are very high for the president to make that decision, any president, to make that decision unilaterally. So that's where Congress comes in to pull that back. And this is very, very hard. And you know from your time on the Hill and in government that we're going to have to build a coalition. It's going to have to be bipartisan of folks that agree with the principle of this. And there is an alignment, actually, both sides. There is bipartisan support for what I just described, for that rebalancing of war power authority and that reassertion of the congressional role in that we have to build. And we're endeavoring to do that.
Okay, very good. Yes, Susanna, please, if you could use the microphone, or maybe we could pass it around.
Thanks very much. I'm wondering about something you said earlier. So we, as you mentioned, we in the United States might find ourselves in some jeopardy for our support. But I'm wondering about something. If we assume that Netanyahu is going to be dethroned in the next months or at least a year, but even if he's replaced perhaps by Benny Gantz, there'll be far right-wing people in the coalition. And those people are talking about turning away from the United States altogether and purchasing weapons, et cetera, from Russia, from India, from China. And that raises, and I don't think that will happen, but that raises the other question, for what does the United States need Israel as an ally? If it loses Israel as an ally, how will that jeopardize the status of the United States or military strength?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, some of this is our commitment to a Jewish state, right? Which obviously came out of the Holocaust and recognizing that there should be a Jewish state for the safety and security of the Jewish people. And I think that is a valid and a worthy objective to support. Additionally to that, Israel has been a security partner for a very long time throughout the Middle East. And I would like to see that continue. And it's going to have to continue, I think, in a different way going forward, given the current makeup of the government. So the third is, you touched on this, the current government and the challenges of the current government. You know, the misalignment between Prime Minister Netanyahu and U.S. interests is substantial. And even if Netanyahu didn't exist, as you point out, Benny Gantz has been very clear that he doesn't necessarily disagree with the conduct of the military operation and believes there should be a Rafah offensive, which I vehemently disagree with and think would be catastrophic and would be a humanitarian disaster. So he isn't necessarily the answer to our short-term military and national security and humanitarian challenges. So it's not our job to dictate the politics of Israel. That's for the Israeli people, but it is our job, and it is my job to make sure that our support is consistent with our values and our interests. And that's why I've been pushing, as a member of the Intel Committee, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to make sure that we are applying our standards as they exist so that we are consistent with our interests.
The strategic importance.
Say again?
What is the strategic importance of Israel for the United States?
So for folks who might be listening at home, I'm going to
repeat.
repeat.
What is the strategic importance to the United States of the relationship with Israel, is what Professor Heschel is asking?
Yeah, so Israel, as the strongest democracy and as a strong military power in the Middle East, has helped with security in the Middle East in a variety of ways and in a variety of circumstances in the United States, and that has been valuable.
But to follow up on this, I think you do watch the Biden administration now shifting to support a ceasefire agreement, arguing again for a two-state solution, which many feel is ambitious given the way that the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis could imagine a future. And other speakers prior to you here really raised some concern that there may not be yet deep thinking about what happens when the definition of ending Hamas is realized, or even if it's not realized, how does Israel have security? How do the people of Gaza, the West Bank have security? What could that be? I always set you up for asking you the tough questions, which I'm telling you we don't have easy answers for, but let me go ahead and ask anyway. What could you imagine, given what you said, that it's not really up to us, but the U.S. is an ally partner who has a lot of sway? What do you think we should be pushing for there?
Well, first of all, I often hear this comment, oh, we have to destroy Hamas. Well, what does that mean, right? Because Hamas, yes, is a military terrorist organization, but it's an ideology, right? It's a terrorist organization. And you can't destroy that with military power. You can't, right? If you could destroy a terrorist organization with military power, the United States, after spending $3 trillion, 6,500 lives in 20 years, would have beat the Taliban, would have destroyed Al-Qaeda, would have destroyed ISIS. But we didn't, right? Because unless you actually go to the roots of the issue, which are humanitarian issues, which is hopelessness, which is fear, which is lack of basic rights, which is lack of self-determination, which is lack of a voice for people, unless you address those issues too, you will do this forever. You just will. That's not to say that there isn't a military component to this, because there are terrible people that exist that do terrible things. We've seen that time and time again. And those people need to be brought to justice. And sometimes the military needs to do that. My broader point being that you can't just think that with military force or an offensive alone that you will achieve that objective. There's nothing in history that would suggest that that's possible. Right? So where does that lead us?
Yeah.
That inevitably leads us to a two-state solution, which in my view is the only path to peace, that you cannot achieve that unless the Palestinian people have a state, and unless we create the conditions for that. Now, this is a generational challenge, right? Yeah. This is not something that's going to happen a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This is going to take decades, right? And it's going to create the United States stepping in and helping not just lead, but facilitate, because we can't lead this, right? This is going to have to be a collaborative effort by Arab countries, by others to see who funds it, what reconstruction looks like, what security looks like. Security within Gaza cannot be done by the IDF. We can't go back to before 2006 to a permanent occupation of the Israelis in Gaza. That will not result in security. There has to be what I believe an Arab-led peacekeeping force. So who that is, how they're trained, how they're funded, is a part of the details. So, we're starting to have those discussions. The administration has been having those discussions about how this is going to be financed, what a reconstruction looks like, who's going to conduct security. But what is happening now can close doors, right? And that's why it's really important that we achieve a mutual ceasefire with the return of hostages. Right? We have to get the hostages back, and there has to be a mutual ceasefire that ends the devastating civilian toll within that area, within Gaza, that flows in massive humanitarian aid, because you have 1.1 million Palestinians who in the next 2 months are on the verge of famine. We cannot allow that to happen. So that must be stopped, and we have to surge resources to prevent that. Otherwise, you're building towards what, right? If the destruction continues.
So I think you're making a good point about the ceasefire and the U.S. shift in the Security Council resolution, which rather than vetoing, we abstained and had 2 paragraphs, one calling for ceasefire and one the release of hostages. Yeah. There's a long ways to go between a Security Council resolution and what you've rightly pointed out is maybe a decade's worth of work to get to a two-state solution. I'm going to push you a little bit more. What do you see in the short run building that bridge that might allow this to actually come about?
Well, as I kind of alluded to, I think we need to have the mutual ceasefire now, right? Because you're not going to be able to have another peacekeeping force come in. I was talking to the head of an Arab country not too long ago, and he said, the ceasefire is the initial necessary first step, because no peacekeeping force or security force is going to come in, as he said, riding on the heels of IDF tanks, right? Because you lose legitimacy if you're perceived as the follow-on force, right? So you have to create literal and figurative space in time for a follow-on force to come in and to start creating space, to buy ourselves more time and space, to build a larger peacekeeping organization, and then build capacity within the Palestinian Authority, right? Which, of course, doesn't have a lot of legitimacy in Gaza right now, right? So looking at how do you create a bureaucracy, a technocratic Palestinian Authority that can deliver services, that can govern, while you build political capacity, while you simultaneously maintain security. And of course, that has to be funded. I think some of the neighboring Arab countries play a really important role in that in particular.
All right, well, thank you. Lillian, did I see you, or Tarek, either one? Or I have a gentleman back here.
Hi. So you're a strong advocate for accountability. Both at the U.S. and the Afghanistan war, you advocated for the United States to share intelligence with the ICC for Russian war crimes. Something a lot of people have accused the United States of recently is that we're not doing enough to hold Israel accountable for the civilians that are being killed in their offense against Hamas. And my question is, what do you think, what role do you think the United States should play in holding our partners and allies accountable for their military policy towards civilian harm mitigation and the harm they are committing against civilians when they are exercising their right to self-defense? And does the United States have a role for influencing the policy of our allies and partners and trying to hold them to a higher level that matches sort of the U.S. military's level, or is that sort of an unrealistic expectation?
Yeah, so I'm of the view, as I talked about earlier, that if we're supporting and working with a partner or an ally, that we should hold those folks to the same standard that we hold ourselves to. I just believe that makes sense, and we can't pursue our own goals and policy if we hold other people and are supporting people to a different standard. And I've spent my time in Congress doing that, from being the founding chair of the Protection of Civilians and Conflict Caucus to creating a center of excellence for civilian protection in the Department of Defense, which I did a couple of years ago, to helping build out what's called the CHIMRAP, the Civilian Harm Reduction and Mitigation Program within DoD, to helping oversee the State Department, which recently created something called the CHIRG, the Civilian Harm Incident Reduction Guidance, and doing oversight there, to passing a law last year, which I did, and I got a provision into the Intel Authorization Act, which then was absorbed into the National Defense Authorization Act, and it is now law, that says that the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, must keep tabs on civilian casualties that occur whenever we provide intelligence to a partner and ally. And they have to report to Congress those civilian casualties, an accurate count, right? So that's law. That's a law that I passed. And we're coming up on the deadline for that, right? So we're going to be working to make sure that RIIC actually complies with that law and that we get a full accounting and full visibility to what's actually happening. Because good policy starts with actually good information, right? How many casualties are we talking about? Who are they? Where are they? Who are combatants? Who are non-combatants? So accountability starts with accounting. And that's what we're trying to do, is gather that information now.
Do you think the U.S. has, that is more ambitious than most countries have as far as tracking civilian harm goes? It sounds quite extensive, and I know that it's been an ambition for the United States for a long time, but you yourself, as you said, you saw things, Iraq, Afghanistan, that this is hard to do.
It is hard to do, but worthy things are hard to do.
Absolutely.
Right? And if you want to be a leader and if you want to do things right, turns out that's not easy.
Okay.
Yes, I think we are developing a gold standard, and these things are actually being developed now. The CHIMRAP that I talked about, the CHIRG actually is new, was just issued in August of last year. Creating good policies and guidelines is the first step. Implementing them is often the hard work.
All right.
So that's where we're at, is the pushing for implementation. But we are, I know we're doing a lot because other countries are taking notice. In fact, numerous other countries have come to the Department of Defense, have taken note of these efforts and said, hey, Tell us what you're learning. Share your best practices with us. We want to learn from you as well, which is a good position to be in.
Absolutely. I think that's some of the tension in the question is that there are different interpretations of what protection of civilians and IHL requires at the national level. So perhaps the U.S. can help have that conversation and develop the operational guidance to actually implement that. I see Tarek Al-Aziz. And then if the student in the back would like to come up too.
The title is about American credibility in the world. And I think here we're talking a lot about implementing guidelines, as if it's like a, how do we make certain things correspond to what we initially said? And there needs to be a moral stand that is taken in the face of this immense catastrophic violence that we are seeing. And that is the sign, in a way, of a true leadership for the United States. So when is the United States going to, or would the United States at some point say enough is enough? And we understand the guidelines, we understand the rules and implementation. It goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
And also the other question is the idea of the two-state solution. There's a lot of, are we going to go back to Oslo? Because that's also part of the problem, that there is this, Oslo did not lead to the imagined or the hoped for state. So now if we bring back the guidelines, aren't we going to go back to the Oslo scenario where also there is a lot of, security details and so on that are not going to lead us to where we need to arrive, which is a real political settlement that gets to the root of what we are seeing today.
Yeah. Well, I talk about the guidelines and the policies we have in place because those guidelines and policies should be, and in many cases are, a reflection of our values, right? So I don't talk about those as divorced from or separate from our values or as a way not to answer that question, because all of this should be value and morality driven, right? And when I talk about the issue of civilian casualties, for example, I always lead that and say the morality of not killing civilians should be enough, right? But if it's not for some folks, then let's look at the strategic objectives component and whether or not it's actually achieving our objectives and making us safer and furthering the interests of the American taxpayer, right, or my constituents. So I don't disagree with you there. And there's plenty of folks, and I'm one of them, that has said enough is enough, that this approach is not the right approach. It's undermining everyone's interest in security, and it needs to stop. That there has to be a massive departure. In fact, in December, I joined with 5 of my colleagues. All of us are national security members of the House, either members of the military or members of the intelligence community who in prior lives worked in national security and are now members of Congress. They wrote to the president and said, it's time for us to use all of our leverage and our relationship to accomplish a drastic shift and change. So that goes back to December timeframe. And we've been looking at all the avenues to try to impact that, right? I'm one member of the House. I'm not the president. So I have to look at, how can I use my influence, whether that be as a member of the Intel Committee, pushing on the intelligence component of this, or foreign affairs, or armed services. So that's my challenge. But yes, it's not moving in the right direction, and it's certainly not serving everyone's interests. And we need to have a drastic change, and it needs to happen now, because obviously the number of casualties already are significant, but they're looking at being a lot more significant still in the months ahead if we don't change things, including a massive surge of humanitarian aid.
All right, I think I saw some hands back here, and then we'll go down front. Just come up to the microphone. That might be easier. Yeah, thank you.
Does this work? Okay. So, after the Russia-Ukraine invasion, the United States was very quick to condemn Russia, and the government has obviously come down very strong on them, encouraging sanctions, and some officials have even gone so far as to call it genocide. At the same time, the United States is providing billions of dollars of aid to countries like Saudi Arabia, who's regularly accused of war crimes in Yemen, or Israel, whose campaign in Gaza has killed 25,000 civilians and left 60% of the housing there inhabitable. Do you think that the United States has a double standard when it comes to criticizing civilian casualties with countries that we view as allies versus countries that we view as adversaries?
Yeah, no, I don't think we have a double standard. I think, first of all, I think those examples are different, right? If you talk about Russia, Ukraine, certainly what Russia is doing is different, as I talked about earlier, than what we're seeing in Israel and Gaza. That's not to say that I don't have some deep concerns and have pushed for a change in our level of support and our alliances with some of these countries. And part of this has to do with what I think has to be a watershed change in the way that we approach national security and foreign policy, right? So we have a history, I think, of making short-term decisions based on either national security needs or economic needs, whether that's for energy or trade or something else. And will support regimes that don't operate consistent with our values, right? And what I would like to see is a more alignment between our values and our aid and our national security that puts people first, what I call a people-centered security. Instead of a state-to-state arrangement, looking at the rights of people everywhere and making sure that those are aligned with our goals. So that's an evolution and change that I think is happening. In my view, sometimes happening way too slow, but we have to continue to push and catalyze over time.
All right. I saw a young woman down here, and then the gentleman on the corner.
Hello. My question is related to the UN Security Council resolution that was passed recently. I have twofold question. Firstly is that given that U.S. has vetoed like most of the resolutions in the past, what recently changed in its like standpoint and policy point on Israel, given that their relations have been more or less stable? And second is that what precedents does it set for other countries when it comes to UNSC resolutions, given the ceasefire was not really put into effect? How does it like then impact other leaders in the world in terms of whether they have to listen to UN or not?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak on behalf of the administration, right? I wasn't in the rooms in the discussion when they were doing the analysis of whether to veto or whether to abstain. I haven't spoken to the president about this or the Secretary of State about this issue. What I believe and what I think is that there were issues with the language, from my perspective, on how a ceasefire is described in the issue of hostage return. And we've made progress on the issue of including hostage release in the language. But what's really important to me is that we're clear on the language of ceasefire. And what I've called for is a mutual ceasefire. Because what's not tenable is for either side to say they're laying down arms and ceasefiring, but not having the other side do the same. Right? It has to be mutual, and all sides have to do that for it to actually be effective and for both sides to have security. And that's what I've been pushing for, and I think that's been some of the concern in the prior iterations of resolutions.
And do you have a view on whether, because of this resolution, there's more likeliness that a ceasefire may actually take hold? Is that something that you have any sense of as a member of either the House Foreign Affairs Committee or the Intelligence Committee?
I don't know. I'm not sure the impact of the resolution. What I can say is that the administration has been working hard and sending Director Burns, actually our director of the Central Intelligence Agency, has been our emissary and has been making regular trips to try to bring all the parties together to achieve a ceasefire. And Director Burns, has a history as a diplomat, started his career in State Department, now is the director of the CIA, but he's an incredible man, incredibly talented, and I know he understands this issue well, and has been working night and day to try to get to a point where all parties will agree to step back and to effectuate a ceasefire, because I think he believes, based on the testimony and some of the conversations I've had with him, that is that necessary first step. That we need to create space and time for some peace to get hold and for us to get back on track to ultimately a longer-term security arrangement. But that starts with a mutual ceasefire.
All right. The gentleman here.
Howdy. I was actually in your district until redistricting in 2020.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Highlands Ranch or?
South Denver.
Okay. Well, bummer to lose you.
I like Diana to get to.
But you found your way to come to a town hall nonetheless.
I know, all the way out here. So you've talked a lot over the last hour about what America is doing, what America isn't doing, what America should do, what America has done. One thing I've been reading a lot about and thinking a lot about in the past few weeks is the Suez Crisis in 1956, when Britain and France believed they had the power to influence events in the Middle East and overestimated themselves and were ultimately unable to. And after 20 years of wars that have produced, as I'm sure you yourself can testify, very limited results, and 6 months into a war over which America seems to have less influence than any previous Arab-Israeli conflict, do you feel we're approaching the same state as Britain and France in 1956?
I don't know about the Britain and France analogy to 1956, but what I do believe, there's been a lot of folks that have said, oh, we're in a post-American world, right? That our status is diminished, our leadership is diminished, and I just don't think that's true. I think our leadership will look different, and it should look different because we're in what some folks would call a multipolar world, where power is more diffuse. The developing world, the emerging world, or the global south, as some people might call it, has more of a say and more of a vote, and I think that's a good thing. Right? I don't believe that holding on to power or preventing others from sharing power is positive, and it certainly hasn't produced the best results. Right? But that's happening anyhow, regardless of our preferences. So in my view, it's embracing a new version of leadership that's more collaborative and convening, right? That recognizes that other folks have options and a vote in a way that they didn't, but also recognizing that American leadership matters, and it matters a lot. And Ukraine certainly shows that. And even what's going on between Israel and Hamas shows that, right? That American leadership is being looked to, right? Everyone's looking to what we're willing to do. What we're willing to put behind our efforts in all of those instances. Right? Ukraine is the perfect example, where it's the United States that actually put together the 50-plus country coalition known as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group that has supported Ukraine in this war, militarily, economically, in other ways, all of which would not have happened without American leadership. So I just don't buy into the fact that A, we don't have a role to play, and B, that the world would be better without our involvement, right? And that's not to say we haven't made massive mistakes in the past, because we have, right? History shows that. We have made mistakes. But we've also done great things too. In America at its best, when we bring our best, and when we're at our best, we are a very positive presence in the world. So the question is how do we focus on that, and how do we move our policy in a more positive direction, recognizing how the world is changing? And that's my goal.
Professor Fischer.
Thank you. I don't know why we put the microphone so that everybody has to. Anyway.
We'll talk to the Dickey Center about that.
I actually have, I have a question that goes beyond the question of Israel and Palestine, but you mentioned something that kind of triggered the question so I'm going to ask two questions, and you pick the one you want to respond to. You mentioned the disagreement with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but there are many Israelis who are not supporters of Netanyahu, who share his view that we have to finish the job. And for them, and those I'm talking about Israelis who support a two-state solution. But for them, they view a ceasefire now as something that will leave Hamas not intact, but powerful enough to prevent any arrangement in Gaza after the conflict in which they are not the actual ruling body. Which means that the stated goal of moving toward the two-state solution would still be unattainable even without the Netanyahu opposition to it. So how would you reconcile the call for a ceasefire now with this idea that you want to have a new arrangement for Gaza, you want to have a multinational force, and none of this is going to happen if Hamas can prevent it. And a ceasefire, from their view, would enable Hamas to prevent it. So how do you reconcile the two? That's the question.
Well,
That's just the first of your two hard
That's
questions.
the first. And I'll say the second and just go sit there. If we bracket all of, October 7, Israel-Hamas war, all of this, if we go back to October 6, the dominant thinking in Washington was the Middle East is a lot less important today for the U.S. global strategy than it was before. That has started with President Obama, but then it became a kind of a common conventional wisdom with the current administration. Mm-hmm. My question is, has this changed, or is it just the question of Israel and Hamas and the war, and once this is contained, we will go back to the same ideas? Yeah. Is the Middle East necessary for American global strategy?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there, Azadine. Where to even begin? Well, you said in the first part of your first question, the issue of finish the job and sentiment within Israel to do that. And, I understand that desire, right? October 7th was horrific. It was a massive trauma to the country of Israel. It went to the core of their sense of security and belonging, right? And that shockwave still exists within the country, right? So the desire to respond, to reestablish a sense of security and stability is very strong. There's oftentimes the comparisons that, to 9/11, right? And that if proportionally this would have meant, 20,000 deaths on 9/11, thousands captured, and how we would have responded. And sometimes I'll get that. They'll say, well, how would we have responded? And that's I think, the wrong answer, or question, rather. Asking how would we have responded is the wrong question. The right question is, how should we respond? Right? And when you're injured and wounded, you certainly have the right to respond, and you should. But that's where you come into the question of how should we and how will we achieve our long-term goals. And when we embarked on our global war on terror in 9/11, there were certainly a lot of questions, not as many as there should be, and there should have been at the time. And we weren't having the debate then about these issues as we're having now on this issue, about where is that going to lead us, right, if we go into Iraq and Afghanistan. What is the end game here? And we now know after 20 years, and as I mentioned earlier, trillions of dollars and thousands of lives lost and missed opportunity and missed U.S. credibility, that wasn't necessarily the right approach. And that's why we're having this discussion now, as hard as it might be, on the heels of a very catastrophic and traumatic event, to make sure that we're forcing a discussion that, frankly, the United States maybe should have had after 9/11. That's the first part. And the second part about the role of the Middle East, I mean, one of the old adages is that you can ignore the Middle East, but the Middle East is not going to ignore you, is certainly true. I do believe that the United States is a world leader, and as part of that, we don't get to ignore vast parts of the world, right? Nor should we, for that matter. Because if we do, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that we are attached to what happens throughout the world will always be true, economically, security-wise, in almost every other way. So we don't have the luxury of ignoring a large region of the world anymore. And I don't think, when and if we resolve this in a positive way, which I hope and think we can, that we should go back to focusing elsewhere. I don't think we have that luxury.
Well, maybe you could be the author of the next national security strategy, which I think wanted us to pivot to China, and then people have argued we got diverted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now we're back in the Middle East. And it does raise the question of, can we, even when necessary, show the right mix of diplomatic muscle, economic persuasion, and judicious use of force to really play the leadership role that you're describing, which you don't have to answer right now. I saw one last hand, and then we'll have to finish this off. Go, please, step up.
Hi, isn't that going to work? I can project. I'm wondering if you
could speak in the microphone for our audience at home. Thank you.
I'm wondering if you can respond to, which is to say, I'm wondering if you read the same New Yorker article I read a few weeks ago about the Al-Hol prison on the Iraq-Syria border. It was a very disturbing article. The extent of human suffering in that prison was really sobering, and I'm wondering if you could speak to what the United States should do, is doing, can be doing, isn't doing to alleviate the human suffering in that prison.
Yeah, I did not read the article, but I have been paying attention to Al-Hol for many years, and you're right. It is a humanitarian problem as well as a security problem, right? And Al-Hol refugee camp is a camp slash jail prison that came out in the heels of our fight against ISIS, right? So during the counter-ISIS campaign. The women and the children and others, a lot of brides of ISIS fighters and other things have gone to Al-Hol. And there they have sat. And there's a couple of challenges with Al-Hol. Number one is it's largely secured by Kurdish fighters, right, which are very under duress, various levels of training and equipment. So the actual security of the camp itself is always in question. And there have been attacks against the camp from the outside by ISIS fighters and others. Number two, there are now generations being born in Al-Hol that are being raised in the camp, and vast swaths of the camp are actually no-go zones, right, where they've imposed Sharia law. There have been stonings and beheadings and other things that are occurring in the camp. So it's a very dire situation. Then the third is, what do you do with the folks, right? Because there's people from dozens of different countries and nationalities, right? There's Brits, there's Iraqis, there's Syrians, there's French, and folks don't want to take these people back. Is the hard reality, right? They don't, because they view them as a security threat. So there they sit in this camp, and countries don't want to repatriate them. So my view is it's going to take the hard task of looking at how do you repatriate folks that have been in that environment, in some cases have been raised in an environment, have known nothing but it, and reintegrate them into different societies effectively, or are we just going to make the decision to keep them in that permanent state? Right? That is the decision, because right now inaction means that decision. That we're just going to allow the camp to exist in perpetuity that way, which doesn't seem like a good solution. So that's going to require all the countries with nationals, people with citizens there to come to the table, and a lot of those are from EU countries. And frankly, right now the EU has not been eager to engage in that project. But I've taken a couple of trips and spoken with some of the EU leadership about the issue to push them to do so.
Is this sort of what you first referred to in the beginning, is you've seen enough untenable situations that it motivates you when you think about both what our principles and our interests are?
Yeah, I mean, we have no shortage of challenges and what seem to be untenable situations, right? There's suffering in vast swaths of the world right now, right? And instability is on the rise, and volatility is on the rise, and mass migration is on the rise. And we didn't even talk about Sudan.
Right.
We didn't even talk about Haiti. We didn't talk about, I can go on, where there are hundreds of thousands and millions of people, at risk of being killed or starving in all of these places. So we have no shortage of challenges, there's no doubt.
But despite that grim assessment, I think you've really given us some hopeful things to think about, including that we can hold more than one thought in our head that may contradict each other, that there is a role for Congress to play, and there's people like you trying to work I think, across the aisle to try and, maybe it feels very technical, but actually implement some of the policies from the high level down into the details. And that you're hopeful that U.S. leadership can actually make a difference, even though we've made mistakes in the past, that we could perhaps speak to our better angels and center our foreign policy on humans and the protection of civilians. So I find that a very inspiring frame, to use your phrase of framing. So we may not have all the answers, but perhaps we can invite you back in the future to get to the rest of it. Please join me in thanking our guests.